Back to the Future is one of my favorite movies of all time. I've always liked the concept of time travel. It's like my favorite sci-fi subject. So I always thought it was a really cool aspect of storytelling because it's a huge box of puzzles to try to get it to work. And a lot of movies and shows do it really good, but then there's a couple of times where movies and shows screw it up and have tons of plot holes. So it's a catch-22 problem when you deal with time travels. But what I want to talk about in Back to the Future is something that people don't really discuss about it, because everyone always talks about how great the story is, the characters. People really don't look at the time travel aspect and how many times things were altered and the severity of certain things, exactly how many times history was changed from the very little to the huge alterations that Biff did in the second film. Because usually when we watch Back to the Future, we usually just remember the key thing. Marty gets trapped in 1955, he screws up his first meeting of his parents, so he has to bring them back together, or he gets erased from existence. The second film is the whole fiasco where Biff steals the sports almanac, gives it to his past self, and creates Hell Valley. With the third film, Marty trying to rescue Doc from the past. So we only really follow like 3 major timelines through the movies. But when you really look at the films, there's many more timeline changes throughout, because in the Back to the Future universe, time can be altered. It's not a predetermined paradox where this must happen in like other sci-fi settings. Let's see how many alterations actually happen throughout all 3 Back to the Future films. And we have to start off with Timeline A, meaning there was no time travel at this point. Marty's parents ran their original course in history. They married, fell in love, but they had that crappy life. Marty didn't really have a chance to, excel in areas that he would have liked. Doc dies, unfortunately, in this timeline if Marty doesn't go back in time, and he gets killed by the Libyans. The Twin Pine Mall still exists. There's no ledge break at the courthouse. And of course, Biff is still an asshole. Once Marty goes to 1955, we first get to Timeline B, is when he runs over the Twin Pine Ranch pine trees, so it turns the mall into Lone Pine Ranch. Next up is Timeline C. Marty interrupts the fateful encounter between his parents, creating the huge paradox of him being erased throughout the first film. Now, the Back to the Future 1 paradox is actually bigger than what you really get to let on. Not only it's the erasure of Marty doesn't meet Doc. That means Doc's first experiment happens in a completely different way, which then prevents Marty from going back in time to cause this. If the space-time continuum can get blown up by just Jennifer looking at her past and future self at the same time without fainting, I really think, causing a paradox, preventing the first time travel experiment would be a much bigger thing. Next, after Timeline C, you'd think that would be really it, but no. As Marty interacts more with 1955, he continues to create alternate timelines. And we move on to Timeline D when Marty meets Doc and shows him the DeLorean for the first time. Now, of course, Doc understands the implications of him seeing his future successes. You have to also think about it from this perspective. The reason why Doc is so anal of not wanting to change history is because now he has responsibility of creating the time machine. But because you know of your future and what you accomplished, you're going to potentially second guess yourself. Even though you don't know all the details, you know you'll create this, but you don't know when or how or why. And if you have thoughts of should I do this? Should I not do this? Or I really want to build this, you can accidentally create the time machine earlier or later, which can end up preventing the actual proper time to go. So that's the reason why Doc is any little thing like this could just screw everything up. Now, another thing that the movies don't bring up is that, Marty did change history. It is a positive change to his family, and it doesn't really overall affect anyone else in the universe. But he did do basically what Biff does in the second film. He improves his personal family life because now George, since he decked Biff, he was more confident. He didn't have to deal with, Biff being a dick to him anymore. which then returns improved their overall life because he took more chances, more risks. He wrote his first novel, which gave him a good payday, so they got better furniture and whatnot in their home. Marty was brought up more in line of be more assertive, be more take your chances, be more cooler. So that's the reason why Marty got his car. And it also did change Biff's timeline because he wasn't allowed to leech off George and whatnot. He only was able to become that cleaning car company. But before even all that, we go to timeline F when Marty decides to write the letter for Doc in hope to prevent his death. But luckily Doc read the note and he's like, all right, this is what happens. I'll deal with it. And he did. And the timeline chases continue because we have timeline G when Doc breaks the ledge on the clock tower. Then we go on to timeline H, which is the before changes they do to 2015, meaning Doc has left 1985, he went to 2015, Hover converted the DeLorean, but then finds out the history of what happened to Marty in the future, where he finds out his kids were arrested and thrown in jail. So after that, and Doc says, I want to repay Marty a favor after him saving his life, so he comes back to 1985 and creates timeline I, where he brings Jennifer and Marty to 2015 to prevent his kids from going to jail and taking that fall from Griff. But in the process of this, Biff in the past sees the flying DeLorean, which has him be remembered in the future. Then we go on to timeline J, where Marty successfully stops his future kids from going to jail, inadvertently gets Griff and his goons to go to jail instead, and at the same time, because old Biff remembers he saw a flying DeLorean in the past, he put everything all together and plus overheard what Marty wanted to do with the almanac, took his idea, and stole the car. Then we go to a very small history change when Jennifer meets herself and goes through her future house. And when all that's going on, we go to timeline L when old Biff steals the car and goes back in time to give his past self the sports almanac, which causes the largest paradox of all the films because of a couple of reasons. The whole focus on Back to the Future 2 was to prevent Hell Valley from being created. We saw the fate of alternate 1985 Doc, Marty, and George McFly. We focused so much on the horrific act that Biff did that killed George in 1973, but Doc kind of didn't really explain the situation that Marty and they were in. When Biff killed George in 1973, it set off a chain reaction of events. Lorraine was forced to marry Biff. Marty and the kids had to grow up under that horrific circumstance, and eventually them either becoming drunks, forced out of the country, and Doc eventually being committed. It was their way of, they don't want to deal with duplication problems, so they were like, well, let's write Marty and Doc out of this part of the story. But at the same time, this caused a huge paradox because, this part of the story is kind of like, non-canon because we don't really know the whole picture. But from what we see in the film, if Doc is inside the insane asylum and Marty is in Switzerland, and because George has died and he grew up in a much more horrific situation, how did Doc and Marty meet? If they couldn't meet or couldn't meet under the same circumstances, then the first experiment of the time machine couldn't happen. Whether the time machine couldn't be invented at all due to the fact that Doc was committed, or because Doc didn't meet Marty, the events of the first experiment did not happen. So what most likely happened is that the first experiment never happened and the time machine never existed. So Biff from the future could not go back in time. And the only reason why Marty and Doc are still here is because of the rules of the first Back to the Future movie that's set up. It takes time for history to catch up to yourself. So while Doc and Marty were just really worried about getting the sports almanac away from past Biff, they were not thinking that they themselves and the DeLorean would have been eventually erased if they actually didn't exceed within probably close to a week. We don't know really how fast the timeline erasure works because in some instances it's faster than others. There's no real consistency of it because in some cases, like Biff, for example, future Biff, when he came back, he was killed by Lorraine by 2015, so he got erased fairly quickly. And then, of course, like the Western Union scene at the end of Back to the Future 2, so it's possible a huge paradox takes a long time to be erased, while minor ones quickly update the universe. Speaking of when old Biff came back to 2015, that all became another timeline. So while they all left the house, that version of Marty was erased and got replaced by another family. And so that became its own timeline. Then we move on to Timeline N when everyone returns to 1985A, or aka Hill Valley, where all the events happen in there and where Jennifer and Einstein are stuck. Followed by Timeline O, because now we do return back to 1955, but now we have the events from 2015 creating a new timeline that includes old Biff and now a second DeLorean with a second Doc and Marty in 1955. There's more and more time changes as we go along. Next up is Timeline P, when Marty goes to try to get the almanac from Biff during the dance. Because now Marty's there, the goons see him this time, so that he inadvertently causes a new paradox where when the goons find him on stage and they think it's future Marty, he'll prevent him from going back in time, so he has to fix that mistake. Then we go to Timeline Q, where Marty tries to get the sports almanac from Strickland. Biff finds Marty, stealing the almanac after he was knocked out by George. And then Marty has to follow him with the hoverboard during the tunnel chase sequence. And he almost caused a paradox himself because he was stupid to watch himself through the doorway. And then we get to Timeline R, where Marty successfully gets the almanac back. Biff crashes into another manure truck and he burns it, which then reverts the timeline back. But thanks to Doc inadvertently being sent back to 1885, it sets off all these other timeline changes. The DeLorean is struck by lightning, it crash lands, Marty is now stranded in 1955. Doc has to write the Western Union letter for Marty in order to find the DeLorean in the future. The DeLorean has to now be stored. Doc changes the timeline even further when he rescues Clara from falling into Shonash Ravine. And then 1 week later, Doc dies from Biff, so the tombstone now shows up in 1955. After that, we go to Timeline T, because now Marty has to now tell 1955 Doc that he's stuck there and he needs to go back to the future. Now only lists for a short time. Now remember, originally Doc wanted Marty to just go back to 1985 and destroy the time machine. So before Marty ever noticed the tombstone, and because Marty originally was going to honor Doc's wishes and not get him from 1885 because he doesn't want history to be screwed up anymore, Timeline U was created, which was basically an alternate version of Timeline E. But since Marty decided to go back in time to rescue Doc from being murdered, he created Timeline V, which is an actual amalgamation of Timeline E, because now that Marty is back in 1885 and he does warn Doc that he's going to be killed by Biff in 1 week, he partially restores the timeline for a short bit, because remember, Clara has to die in order for Shonash Ravine to be called Clayton Ravine. So at this point, while they're trying to figure out what they can do with the DeLorean because it doesn't have any more gas, he doesn't meet up with Clara, so she was headed to her death in this point. But then they did meet up with Clara eventually, which created Timeline V, which is an amalgamation of the original timeline and the current timeline changes. Followed by Timeline W, when, since now Marty is back in 1885, he prevents Doc from being killed during the Clock Tower festivals, because there was no rule of the Doc not dying for several days, because back in 1885 they couldn't do much for gunshot wounds, so Doc could have easily had died across 2 or 3 days, and that's would have been his fate originally. But since now Marty is back here, he prevented that, but inadvertently now replaced Doc's place on the tombstone. So now Marty's dealing with Biff trying to kill him. Doc has just broken up with Clara. He doesn't even know what to do anymore because, again, he betrayed her. She doesn't want to see him anymore because, all this stuff happened. So now he's gotten depressed, which has now created Timeline X. Marty has to figure out a way out of the situation without getting himself killed, bring Doc back to the future. Luckily, he used his brains this time instead of running on emotions, and he stopped his death, destroyed the tombstone, got that erased, preventing Doc from ever being killed, preventing himself from being killed. And so they move on to Timeline Y, where Marty and Doc steal the train for the DeLorean run. So Marty alone successfully returns to 1985. The DeLorean time machine is destroyed. destroyed, leaving Doc and Clara alive in 1885. And we still have timeline changes. Thanks to, Marty being here, and everyone always assumes that, Doc had to explain where Marty went. So Doc probably told the town that Marty tried to stop the robbers of the train, and he died when the train, went off into the ravine. So the ravine was now changed to Eastwood Ravine. And even after all those changes, we still have one timeline change left. Since, Marty has gone through all these, points in history and saw his fate and the way he acted, which got him into huge situations where he almost got himself killed, he learned his lesson for not overreacting when someone called him chicken, which then in return made him not do the stupid race with needles when he first got back to 1985, preventing the 2015 future that everyone saw originally back in part 2. So out of all 3 films, there's 27 timeline changes ranging from very minor things to huge universe-ending timeline shifts. And I think that's why I really enjoyed Back to the Future, because everyone tried to do a good thing, but then it also showed the dangers of dealing with time travel, because no matter what good you try to do, you can inadvertently screw yourself in so many different ways. You can cause people to die, cause people to not to exist, cause hell on earth to happen. But then also the positives out of the film, not to be scared of a stupid, idiotic bully from 1955. I think that's why everyone loves the story, because even though it involves time travel, Back to the Future was able to combine a very, complicated sci-fi trope into something that everyone can enjoy, because you don't have to know the technical know-how how the DeLorean works or really care about the timelines. I do. I love all that aspect, so I always like looking and digging into the movie to see all those details they came up with or the mechanics of how it works. But also everyone can enjoy the simple story of 2 people falling in love and just trying to save your butt. That's what I think Back to the Future did really well in all 3 stories. It also brings up so many different genres as well, because it's not just like we're going to the 50s, we go to the future, so you get that aspect, but then you also go to the past. So you have so many different, eras of history that, so many people can like and enjoy. So yeah, there's a ton of timeline changes if you look through that. And there might be some details that I actually overlook, because there's a lot of stuff that you have to think about, like, how was this altered? Was this changed? Did this follow the original timeline? Did Marty intervene with this? Because, even the littlest things, like, for example, the dime that Marty paid for the coffee in the diner was from the 1980s. So right now, in 1955, they had a 1980s dime. And, even though that's such a minor thing, it still changes history to a degree. I totally understand why you wanted the time machine destroyed. Although it's kind of weird, though, that he wanted the DeLorean destroyed because he didn't want it to fall into wrong hands, or the temptation of changing history, even for good reasons, because many people would love to change things that were horrific, either personally or historically. But then Doc ends up building the time train. It's the kind of things you go like, huh, with? But I guess maybe Doc was like, well, if I build it out of a train, it'll be much more harder to steal. Or maybe he went further into the future and got better security. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you found this kind of fun to look through the films and see how many different things that were altered between all 3 films. It's just kind of cool to look at how history was changed throughout Hill Valley through the 3 films.